The Fetterman Massacre was a bad thing, and it went along a philosophy that the Indians were not ever going to attack Fort Phil Kearney, but they were going to try to bait soldiers outside the fort. We talked about the conflict at Pino Creek, where they went over Lodge Trail Ridge and were smart enough or lucky enough to get back with only 2 killed and 3 wounded. And then we talked about the Indians baiting them over Lodge Trail Ridge and the disaster at the Fetterman fight. Well, the Wagon Box Fight was no different. When we talk about the Wagon Box Fight, it was simply another attempt by the Indians to repeat what happened during the Fetterman fight. They wanted to bait soldiers out of the fort and try to get them into an area where they were vulnerable and try to repeat that. So in the summer of 1867, actually on August 2nd of 1867, approximately 800 Sioux warriors attacked another woodcutting expedition. And this particular woodcutting expedition was about 5 miles from Fort Phil Kearney. Why were the woodcutters so far away from Fort Phil Kearney at this point? They had all cut all the wood closer. So as they cut the wood that was closer to the fort and they ventured out, they were now trying to find good forest or good timber, and they were about 5 miles away. So what you have is you have 6 civilians that are cutting wood 5 miles away from Fort Phil Kearney, and 26 soldiers that are protecting them. Now, does that necessarily mean that the soldiers maybe weren't chipping in a little bit? I think that at times they were on duty, but I'm sure they chipped in with the wood cutting on occasion. But basically what you had is you had 26 soldiers and 6 civilians in this wood cutting area against 800 Sioux Indian warriors. A little unbalanced. And they really were camping at this point. In other words, they weren't really cutting wood. On August 2nd of 1867, these woodcutters and soldiers were camped at this wood cutting area. And they weren't really cutting wood, they were just kind of camping in between work, 5 miles from Fort Phil Kearney, and all of a sudden they are going to be attacked by 800 Sioux warriors. Well, what they had done prior to this attack is to keep their horses intact and not have them run off. They had taken the wheels off of wagon boxes like they did inside the fort when we talked about the powder magazine, and they made makeshift corrals that they had the livestock inside of, the horses. So when these Indians started to attack, what do you think they did? Thus the name Wagon Box Fight. They got the horses out of there and they got inside these wagon boxes so they could try to protect themselves from all angles against these approaching Indian warriors. Now, you got 800 against 26. What's the goal of those 26 soldiers? Stay alive and defend themselves until what? Reinforcements or relief can come from Fort Phil Kearney. So the man that was in charge of the military command there was Captain James Powell. And each of these 32 men were equipped with breech loading rifles and had the task of defending themselves against an overwhelming amount of Sioux Indian warriors, hoping they could hold them off until reinforcements arrived. The problem is, how far are they from the fort? 5 miles. So it's going to take the reinforcements a little longer to, say, get to them than it did to have them get to relieve that led to the Fetterman fight. They're farther away. So it's quite a task. Anybody know what breech loading rifles are? Anybody know? Everybody see one? I got one. I'll have to bring it when I get back from DC and show you, because they're kind of interesting. Everybody, Custer's military men had these breech loading 45-70s. These guys had them. Anybody know what they are? What's the difference between a breech loading rifle, Daniel, and a repeating rifle like a Henry's repeater?
Henry would be like
fast as you can, as you can jack the shell in and shoot. Well, these are different. What happens is the rifle, you have to open up the top of the breech and put the shell in, close the breech, fire, open the breech, shell ejects, put them in. Well, when these rifles get hot from a lot of firing, there is a tendency that those cartridges stick in the breech. And sometimes in the Custer battle, especially when it got kind of hot and heavy, they had to bring out their knives and actually pry those out. Well, that takes time. So Powell's in kind of a tough shape. He's got 800 warriors around him, and he's trying to hold these warriors off in this makeshift corral with breech loading rifles. Well, they did a pretty good job. In the end, only 3 men were killed from Powell's command and 2 wounded, and they were able to hold off the Sioux Indians until the reinforcements came. And the reinforcements arrived, and there was not the ability to trap them, so to speak, as they had done in the Fetterman fight. So as soon as the relief came to Powell's command, those 800 warriors dispersed and left. And it was really the last notable fight between Indians and the command at Fort Phil Kearny during the existence of the fort. It was called the Wagon Box Fight. Okay? Well, that'll take us then to our last subtopic, which is the end of Fort Phil Kearny. Now, they knew that Fort Phil Kearny was going to come to an end when Colonel Carrington was relieved of his command and reassigned to another fort, Fort Casper, which should be near present-day Casper, Wyoming. I don't think there's any fort there. There is a Fort Laramie still, but Fort Casper, I don't know if there's much there. So, in early 1868, Colonel Carrington is relieved of his command at Fort Phil Kearny, and he's assigned to Fort Casper. And he had kind of a tough time because a lot of people were talking about how well he did at Fort Phil Kearny. And what do they remember most about his command? The Fetterman fight. And so there were a lot of false reports and people saying things negatively about Carrington. Some true, but most not. And so he basically spent the rest of his life after he retired from the military trying to restore his reputation, trying to prove that these things that were said about him were not true. So he took some heat after he retired, after he left Fort Phil Kearny, because people had heard rumors of what had gone on there and his command was poor, and he spent the rest of his life basically restoring his reputation. Anybody remember what his wife's name was? Margaret. Margaret died not long after they left Fort Phil Kearny. She died, kind of unexpectedly. And Carrington remarried. Anybody want to guess who he might have remarried? Think about it a little bit. See if you can think about who he might have remarried. Who might have been available that we talked about? What? That's a good guess. Fetterman was orphaned and never married, but he married somebody's wife. Grumman's, Lieutenant Grumman, that was killed in the Fetterman fight. He led the cavalry. He ended up marrying his wife. And that might seem kind of weird to you. Some kids go, wow, that's kind of weird. Well, it really wasn't that weird because he lost his wife. She had lost her husband. Obviously, they were friends because he commanded Grumman. They knew each other. And they became friends and eventually got married. So Margaret Carrington died not long after the events of Fort Phil Kearny. And Colonel Carrington then remarried Frances Grumman, who was Lieutenant Grumman's widow. And the kind of interesting thing about the two women is both women wrote books about their experiences at Fort Phil Kearny. Both of them wrote books. Margaret Carrington wrote a book about her experiences at Fort Phil Kearny, and then Frances, or Franny, as she was better known, wrote a book about her experiences at Fort Phil Kearny. And they were polar opposites. Polar opposites. If you read the two books, you'd wonder if they were talking about the same fort. Okay? And I'll tell you why they were. Margaret Carrington was an officer's wife. That was her life. And she thought the political thing to do would be write a book that was favorable to the American West. And she embellished tremendously how great things were at Fort Phil Kearny, when they really weren't, right? We've told you about soldiers' conditions and how much they got paid and some of those things. And of course, we had the Fetterman fight and the massacre. Well, her book was more of an embellishment of what Fort Phil Kearny was like, mainly because she thought that was the political thing to do, that her job was to promote the American West, and she didn't want to say anything negatively about the particular fort at Fort Phil Kearny. Now, Franny, on the other side, when she wrote her book, it was much more realistic and told much more about the real issues at Fort Phil Kearny. explained the conditions men lived under, explained what happened in the Fetterman fight in a more honest perspective. And here's her book here, entitled A Soldier's Wife at Fort Phil Kearney. So she's writing it more from her experiences as being married to Grumman, okay? And so this is the book she wrote here. And hers was much more realistic and much more probably truthful than that of Margaret Carrington, who wrote hers from a public relations point of view. Now, which book would see better light on Colonel Carrington? Which one would make it seem, maybe people say, oh, maybe we didn't judge him correctly? Why would you think Margaret's? Right, well, the other gal ended up being his wife and wrote the book afterwards. If you told the real story, would you maybe understand why Carrington did what he did instead of the embellished story? So actually, Franny's book took more heat off of Colonel Carrington than his first wife's, because she kind of told how it was. You know, the toughness of decisions and what it was like there, etc. So her account, Franny's account, made her second husband's actions probably more justifiable, and that helped him restore his reputation, whereas Margaret's book didn't do that for him. So, in the end, Regan, somebody has to take the heat for the disasters of Fort Phil Kearney. So who really took the heat? Who really got too much credit, and I mean probably bad credit, for the events of Fort Phil Kearney? Who got blamed for everything? Fetterman. And as Jordy had mentioned earlier, and I just told her the difference in facts, is Fetterman was an orphan. He was never married. He had no family whatsoever. Didn't have a mother or father whom he knew. He didn't have a wife or children. So who's going to defend him? Who's going to stick up for him when he gets a bad rap? Nobody. So in the end, Fetterman ends up being the really bad guy at Fort Phil Kearney, in the events of Fort Phil Kearney, because there was nobody alive to defend him. He didn't have a mother or father, didn't have a wife, didn't have children, didn't have aunts and uncles, didn't have anybody. He was on his own. So he's the guy that really gets stuck and probably gets too much bad credit for the disaster, but he has no one to defend him, right? Well, why did Fort Phil Kearney disappear? What happened in American history that made it so we didn't need these forts on the Bozeman Trail anymore? What came about? What? Well, any of these trails. There's many trails, but why are people no longer in 1868 really following these trails too much? They're not packing up their covered wagons. Railroads were built, and railroads got far enough west, the Union Pacific in particular, got far enough west that people quit coming over on covered wagons. They would load up their belongings and get on a train. Would a train be safer through Indian land? Certainly would. And did the railroad put their rail lines through sacred burial grounds and hunting areas? No, because they didn't want the hassle. So all of a sudden, when the railroads come far enough west to get people where they want to get, there's no need for these forts, because there's no need to protect a trail that is no longer going to be traveled. Okay? So in 1868, the government signed a treaty with these 8 Indian tribes again that said that they were going to close the Bozeman Trail and abandon all of those forts that were on the Bozeman Trail. So what does Fort Phil Kearney simply become? One of the forts that is abandoned. Okay? They just abandoned it. And that happened in August of 1868. That's when it was abandoned. August of 1868. So let me ask you this question. When we go see Fort Phil Kearney, how come there's no fort there if they abandoned the thing? How come it's not there? How come we don't see it? No? So if I put something in this room that you despise, and you do everything you can to get rid of it,
the Indians burnt it down.
They burn it to the ground. They approached the fort when everyone left. If you look up at that painting I have to the left of George Washington rowing across the Delaware, that is a painting of the Native Americans lighting Fort Phil Kearney on fire and whooping it up. Matter of fact, it's a little bit exaggeratory, but it has a picture right here of a Native American that's got a rocking chair over his head that he took from the fort. But you can see the fort in flames in the background. But they really did do that. I also have a really nice pewter bust back here. These are pretty, you can't find these everywhere, and I'll even pass this around, you can look at it. And this is a pewter bust of Indians taking down the sign that was in front of Fort Phil Kearney. So, I'm not exactly sure where this bust came from. I got it online, but I've never seen another one. But you can kind of pass that around and look at it. Kind of heavy. Well, from 1866 to 1963, nobody paid a whole lot of attention to Fort Phil Kearney because it wasn't there. It was burnt to the ground. And finally in 1963, Fort Phil Kearney was designated as a National Historic Landmark. And when they designated it as a National Historic Landmark, they started to put funding into it and tried to restore it to a point. Now, if you go to Fort Phil Kearney today, you'll see a really nice small museum there. It's really nice. And then you'll see the boundaries of the fort. And what they've done is they've taken some of these logs, not from then, but logs, about as wide as this room, and they built a wall so you can kind of see what the entire boundary looked like. They have that there. And the rest of it's kind of left up to your imagination. You can see where the cemetery was below Pilot's Knob. You can obviously see Pilot's Knob and those types of things. You can go to the battlefield, the Fetterman fight, and see it. You can go to the Wagon Box Fight and see it. Okay? The Fetterman fight's pretty cool because you can actually, after you've had this lecture, when we get there and get on the top of Lodge Trail Ridge, you can actually see the valley, and you can go all the way and see where Wheatley and Fisher were, the trees still there that the cavalry was killed by. It's pretty cool. So that's kind of the end of the lecture. Now I would ask you this, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to go run you these review sheets here. But I want to ask you this. So I got on the calendar today, and you can imagine May is what? Absolute mess. There's something going on every night. So I am going to schedule this trip on a Saturday, May 4th. There is no activities. There's no soccer, there's no track, there's no nothing. Yeah.
There's a band banquet, or there's the jazz night for band.
On Saturday the 4th? Well, he never puts anything on the calendar. So he's going to be mad on this deal because he's got his awards banquet on Tuesday and his performance on Monday. He's got nothing on the calendar this day. I can assure you, so that'll be interesting. Well, that's the only day we got. I mean, he's got Saturday, Monday, and Tuesday now, I guess, for music. The point being is, we're going to go, thank you for letting me know that. We're going to go Saturday, and we're probably going to leave about 9 o'clock, and we're going to get back probably about 5-ish. So I don't know when this thing is. When is this thing?
I'm not sure. I just know some day.
Well, maybe you could talk to him and see if he might move his a little later, so if you want to do this, you can. It's not mandatory at all. You certainly do not have to go. But I will send an information sheet out to your parents here before I leave on my trip. There's really no cost to you. It doesn't cost to get in there. It won't cost you anything other than you need to bring a sack lunch. And I will, because I like to do this. You probably are tired of it, but I won't do it that often. I do like to stop at the Dash Inn and eat on the way home, because I like their selection. So anyway, you guys, if you want to go to that, I'm going to kind of need to know, and I got to plan accordingly. So I want you to think about that. I went on that calendar day and honestly picked the only day I didn't see something on. So I don't know. We have an awards banquet on a Saturday.
Well, so I think Tuesday is our awards banquet, and then Monday maybe is one of our concerts.
There is one Monday.
But we're doing one on Saturday. It's like just a jazz night, so it'll be Marshaz and the jazz band in order to like raise money.
It'll be like 7 o'clock at night, probably.
It might be.
Yeah, I think we'll be home by 5.
Okay.
But I mean, it's something to think about. And I guess we could accommodate that a little bit by leaving early. You know what I mean? Leaving at 8, leaving at 7, and getting there at 8-ish or so. We'll figure it out. But I'd like you to go. You're not mandatory to go, but obviously I'm not going to take 2 people with me. You know what I mean? And so, if you're interested in that, we'll kind of really, I want you to really think about that a little bit, because I need to have accurate numbers. I need you to commit. I don't want to say we got 20 kids coming and then 4 show up that morning and then we're wound up. So, out of curiosity, you're not going to hurt my feelings. How many people would be interested in possibly doing that? It is a Saturday, and there is no activity. So I already checked that out. How many would consider doing that? Okay, 4, 5, 6 here. Okay. Well, we got to get some sort of a commitment. So I'll nail you down when I get back from DC, and we'll kind of go from there. I put in for the bus, and I made arrangements with the gal there to do it, And so if we have 10 kids who wanna go or so, we might do that, so. I'll keep you in touch, but that's the plan. Okay, I am gonna run, would you like a review? Would that be helpful?
Yeah.
Now, I'll go run some copies of this. It would be very much to your benefit to come Monday with this done, so we can go. I think I have 4 here, so I can give you these 4, and then I'll go run the rest. I need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yep,
Yeah, hold on.
yep, 19, 20, I'll just make 20.
This school day, all 4.
No activity.
I'm busy.
I'm going to soccer practice, and then I'm coming back to Portland to go to the movies and Riley and some other girl I don't know. Lucas.
Being tired.
Did you say what, so you're really that bad now?
Yeah, I am. I woke up and I fell back to sleep till 7:15.
Time to wake up.
So I grabbed my light on.
15.
Huh? No, when I have to go to my house and do stuff.
10:15 is funny, I get up at like 6:30
I get up at 6:40 in the morning.
I get up at 7 and fall back to sleep.
But I had to go to my house and do laundry, so I have clothes to wear this weekend because I didn't have any laundry done.
Me too.
Not mine because, well, actually it's mine, but it's not because I'm not at my own house.
Who needs to do laundry?
No, because last time I tried to wear these pants, I so mad.
Whoa!
These pants, actually.
Whoa.
No, they just don't fit right. You can't wear the same pants twice.
Come on, Angela.
No, they're like too